I got into distilling because I got into whiskey, and I've been to Louisville probably way too many times for training and whatnot. And with a background in mechanical engineering, I've always hated kind of black boxes, so I kind of wanted to learn how whiskey was made, and that drew me into the whole rabbit hole of distilling. Bourbon is traditionally made in the U.S., and actually it's America's native spirits, regionally protected, the same as cognac in France or tequila from Mexico. At Spirits of the Wasatch, we do a 4-grain bourbon, so we have rye, wheat, and barley along with the mix of corn. In general, to be a whiskey, you're going to have to start with grain. There's a huge art to blending. You can get very esoteric when you start talking about whiskey and, oh, it smells like my grandmother's kitchen at Christmas. I've been tasting a whiskey and someone will say, oh, it's got like strawberries, and then I start tasting strawberries, but I definitely didn't taste them before. But gin is a neutral spirit, so essentially vodka infused with botanicals, and the majority of those botanicals has to be juniper. And I'm using local botanicals and native botanicals. We kind of ended up with the Sasquatch. We thought Spirits of the Wasatch and the Sasquatch, the unknown spirits in experimentation in our distilleries.
We are going to be talking to Brant Pounds, who's the owner of Spirits of the Wasatch. And Spirits of the Wasatch is reference to the Sasquatch and the amazing Wasatch range we have. And Brent and I are going to be talking, after a few more people join us, about what makes a great bourbon. I think a lot of people love the idea of drinking whiskey. You see it in movies all the time. All the characters drink whiskey. I don't know who's paying for that, but I'm sure somebody's paying. Like there must be some big whiskey makers paying for these product placements everywhere in movies these days. But what is it that really makes a good whiskey? Because I visited Kentucky, and Brent's here with me. I want to introduce Brant Pounds. He's the owner of Spirits of the Wasatch. Thanks for joining me, Brent.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So I visited Kentucky. I went to Louisville, and I saw like Old Forester, and in Kentucky they make massive, huge amounts of whiskey that you can just buy and put in a bottle with your own label on it. And I want to talk about, for our viewers who are watching, and I'd love to have viewers chime in. Thanks everybody for joining us. What is it that makes a good craft bourbon? Because obviously there are some good players that are big brands. I mean, I don't mind Old Forester. I don't mind Buffalo Trace. I used to love Maker's Mark, but now it's kind of too sweet for my palate. But I love whiskey, and when I have it, I just drink a couple fingers every night till it's gone. But what is it that separates the craft distillery, the craft maker of whiskey, from these giant, massive distilleries?
That's really a tough question, in that there's a lot of different craft producers of whiskey, and there's a lot of range in what those manufacturers are doing, those distilleries. And to your point about sourcing, there's arguments for sourcing, and there's arguments for working that into your overall production plan for the future. Because like you, I got into distilling because I got into whiskey, and I've been to Louisville probably way too many times for training and whatnot.
It's an amazing place.
Yeah. Oh yeah. There's a ton to do there.
Just on that main strip there, like 15 distilleries you can tour or get samples from. Just incredible. So what is it that, I mean, I guess you could start by explaining what is a traditional bourbon whiskey.
So bourbon is traditionally made in the U.S., and actually it's America's native spirit, as designated by Congress back in 1964, except Congress didn't actually say that. The bourbon industry as a whole is kind of good at marketing spin. So that was their take on the act that created, basically made bourbon a distinctive product of the United States. So it's regionally protected the same as cognac in France or tequila from Mexico.
Or Scotch.
Or Scotch, yes.
Yeah.
So it has to be produced in the U.S. or its territories. A lot of people think it has to be in Kentucky, but that's not true. It's anywhere in the U.S. And then in that act, they basically laid down all the rules you have to follow to be able to call something bourbon. And that's essentially majority corn, so at least 51% corn in the mash bill. And then there's a bunch of smaller items, but the next biggest one is it has to be aged in new charred oak. So it has to be a new charred oak barrel.
American oak?
I don't believe American oak is specified, but almost all the barrels are American white oak. There's some people playing with different species of oak. Particularly, there's Oregon oak, which is a different species of oak, and a lot of distilleries up in that part of the country are using Oregon oak barrels, and it definitely imparts a different flavor. But that's once you use the barrel, you're done with it for bourbon purposes.
And you said like the mash bill has to be 51% corn. Obviously, you can use rye. I love rye whiskey, and that's the other variant. But do you think the other ingredients besides corn make it more of an impact on the flavor, or is it what you age it in that makes the biggest impact?
I would say, I always say on our tour that 70% of the flavor comes from the barrel. But remember, 98% of statistics are made up on the spot, so that's just kind of a ballpark. But a majority of flavor does come from extraction from the barrel. But you do have a lot of impact with the grain. And one of the lesser-known rules for bourbon is it has to come off the still at 160 proof or lower. And that's basically 80% ethanol. And it's the remaining 20% there that really gives you the flavor, and that comes from the grain mix. And the most common secondary grain or flavor grain in bourbon is going to be rye. At Spirits of the Wasatch, we actually do a 4-grain bourbon. So we have rye, wheat, and barley along with the mix of corn. But really, when you're talking a corn whiskey or bourbon, corn brings a lot of sweetness with it. So generally, bourbon is going to be sweeter than most of your other whiskeys.
So what classifies then as a whiskey? Like, is there also pretty specific criteria just to make it a whiskey?
I mean, if you're talking the TTB or just in general, to be a whiskey, you're going to have to start with grain. If you start with grain as your base, and then ferment that and distill it, and it goes into a barrel, I believe whiskey also has to be barrel aged, then it's a whiskey.
So are you going do you have a bourbon as well as a whiskey?
Yes. So we do a grain to glass bourbon, and that's pretty much the only whiskey we're distilling at the distillery. And we have a set mash bill. It's about 70% corn, 20% rye, 10% red wheat, and then about 5% barley. And those are approximately, they add up to 105%. So there's a little bit of play in there, but and that would be our bourbon. We're actually, this month, we're going to be releasing Yeti's Dog, which is our white dog or our unaged bourbon. So that comes directly off the still before it goes into a barrel. But it's essentially just the whiskey before you put it in a barrel to get aged. Okay. And it's I've heard people compare it to like tasting the cake batter before you bake the cake.
It's kind of like a moonshine type thing.
Pretty
right?
much.
Yeah. I wanted to plug Brent in this magazine. This is Faces of Utah. And if you haven't seen this is an entrepreneur success guide. If you're doing business or want to do business in Utah, you got to pick this up because you learn from other businesses how they go about doing it and finding their niche in the industry. And so you came from, if I remember correctly, working in national weather. Is that right?
Well, so I worked for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is the parent organization for the National Weather Service. But NOAA, the acronym, is also the parent organization for the Office of Coast Survey. And most people don't know that it has the smallest of the 7 uniform services. So I was a commissioned officer in the NOAA Corps.
That's really
for
cool.
a little over a decade. Yeah.
And I actually am a total weather nerd. I'm so curious about how weather patterns arise, and we talked about this earlier, but to stay on bourbon and to stay on whiskey and how you got into this,
Yeah.
how did you go from being an officer in NOAA to deciding, okay, I really have the passion for distilling, craft distilling, and I really want to take this on?
It's it's kind of convoluted path, but I was set to go out back onto a ship for 2 years, and that was about 6 months after our first child was born, and my wife was not thrilled with that idea, that I'd be gone for essentially 2 years. So that's when I resigned, spent a few years basically doing investment properties, and I got really interested into whiskey in the process, and amassed way too large a collection of whiskey. And with a background in mechanical engineering, I've always hated kind of black boxes, so I kind of wanted to learn how whiskey was made, and that drew me into the whole rabbit hole of distilling. Watched a lot of YouTube videos, became a YouTube expert on the subject. Actually, some of those trips to Louisville were to attend classes at Moonshine University there. So they do a bunch of different courses in distilling, botanicals, workshops, and stuff. And kind of got the idea that maybe we'd start our own distillery when our kids were off to college and were kind of retired. And then we found Hammer Spring Distillers, and JP was looking to sell, and we kind of looked it over, and it seemed like a great opportunity. So my wife kind of pushed me into it, and we ended up owning a distillery a little faster than I was expecting. But I've really enjoyed it over the past couple years. So
that's cool. And I know that's usually how craft brewers come about. They do it at home and have a home brew kit, and then they go into getting the passion for home brewing before they get into that. And so can you do home distilling?
Not legally.
Not legally.
Yeah.
So you got to do it on the real down low if you're going to learn at home.
Yeah. At Moonshine University, they jokingly referred to it as theoretical distilling. So that's
just like the show. That Moonshiner show, I was watching that for quite a while, and I got really into it. And then somebody, I think it was leaked on Reddit or something, that they're all actors. Is that true?
I've found that's true of a lot of reality-based television.
Yeah, I just find that.
I've got stories about friends that were the expert on the show Storage Wars, and they were like, "Oh, it was all made up." So,
really? Wow.
Yeah.
You have a question?
Okay, we got a question.
What's a good bourbon to buy in Utah?
Very good question. I'll let you go first, Brent, and then I'll chime in on my favorites.
Well, I can always be kind of self-serving and say our bourbon is one of my favorites.
Yeah, it's awesome.
But there are a lot of great bourbons being produced here in Utah. There's a lot of local distilleries. I haven't tried all of them, so I hate to single them out. But I've always been a fan of Sugar House. They do a lot of interesting stuff. I particularly liked his last experimental release. It was a distilled beer, so it had hops added, and it's one of the best things I've drank all year.
Who did that?
Sugar House.
Oh, really? Oh,
and
yeah. He told me about that.
Yeah. It was all the characteristics of hops without any of the bitterness, which is the part I dislike the most. So that was really great. And then kind of available in Utah, not anymore. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as far as local distillers go, I think you guys are incredible. Even though they are sourcing their whiskey from outside of Utah, I do love High West Rye. I mean, you can never go wrong, and it's is that produced in Kentucky somewhere,
I believe they get most of their stuff from MGPI, which is Indiana, but I'm not sure.
And then I guess the art of it is in combining different
Yeah.
whiskeys together and then getting that.
There's a huge art to blending, and that's
blending. That's what I'm looking for.
it makes a. I mean, I respect people who can buy or just take 50 barrels and put it together and come up with something unique and delicious by just kind of sampling the barrels and start combining it and kind of mix it all together to get the characteristics they want from every barrel. So there's definitely a large art form there. Yeah.
And I just highly recommend, if you're into whiskey, if you're into bourbon, go do the tour that you guys offer, because I think it's worthwhile to really learn about the spirit from a place and a person actually doing it. And do you want to talk about what you get by going on your tour?
Yeah, I like I said, background in mechanical engineering, so I kind of built the tour as a basic how to do bourbon course, and we probably get way too involved technically. I see some people's eyes glaze over as we're going through, so we'll kind of hurry things along. But yeah, we start from the raw materials and we walk all the way through the production process and the fermenting, and probably way more knowledge than you need about distillation and how it works, and then get into the barrel room and usually finish up with a tasting. So yeah.
Yeah, you were telling me before, it's called, I'm going to butcher this, Amburana wood?
Yeah, the Amburana.
So that's your barrel, that's your really unique barrel program.
Yeah,
Can you explain what that is?
We just released that about 5 months ago, and that's Amburana is also known as Brazilian oak, though it's not actually a species of oak. And it's been used forever to age cachaça, which is a Brazilian rum. In the past couple years, it's gotten really popular both with breweries and then in finishing whiskey, because it's got a lot of kind of baking spice notes. It adds a ton of complexity. And I've been playing with Amburana since before I owned the distillery, kind of secondary finishing whiskeys. I tried pretty much a ton of Amburana whiskeys that are on the market, and usually I find it's incredibly easy to over finish in Amburana. Mm-hmm. We actually finish for less than a week with the Amburana wood, because it does impart so much flavor. And I think if it goes too long, it starts to get astringent and bitter.
So you do a regular aging process in regular American oak, and then you finish it with the Amburana.
Yeah, we actually blend about 85% bourbon with about 15% American malt whiskey. And then that finishes in Amburana together. And that's the malt whiskey. If I hadn't added the malt whiskey, I could have said bourbon finished in Amburana wood. But since it's going to have the caveat of something finished in Amburana wood, I kind of played with a few things. And the American malt whiskey really adds something to it. And with the Amburana wood, I get a very distinct like coconut flavor on the finish that I can't replicate unless I put a little bit of American malt whiskey in there. So
cool.
Yeah.
So we have two questions. One is, what's unique flavor profile? And the other one is, which one is your favorite among the ones you make?
So what's a unique flavor profile as far as the...
I suppose what they're asking is, and maybe you can clarify, when you describe a unique flavor profile, you describe it in terms of spices and finishes. And so, I mean, if you're tasting a whiskey for the first time and you're trying to describe it, how do you classify the flavor profile that you're tasting?
And that's it's extremely subjective, and you can get very esoteric when you start talking about whiskey and, oh, it smells like my grandmother's kitchen at Christmas, and then you kind of have to drill down into what you mean by that. But I've heard a lot of very complicated descriptions on what flavors someone's getting out of a whiskey. I think there is a flavor wheel, and a lot of professional tasters, and I think this was developed in like the 70s or so, starting with wine, and they kind of basically took in a bunch of experts and started pulling out flavors. And it's useful to drink a whiskey and look at those flavor wheels to kind of pull out different flavors and be like, just have it spark in your mind to say, oh yeah, that's what I'm tasting. Some cinnamon or
you got like cinnamon, cardamom, old leather.
Yeah.
You got like sweet finishes. I think when I first got into whiskey, I was into sweet, probably what you'd describe as high corn content.
Yeah.
Maker's Mark was my favorite. And then it just became kind of too sweet for me when I got into ryes, because ryes have this sort of more dry flavor, and it's like more on the aftertaste, I would have to say, than the front of your tongue.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it just kind of coats your tongue, and it's just such a nice finish when you have a great rye. But I mean, I think you do have to be kind of more of a connoisseur. I just kind of know what I like, but I don't know how to describe it.
Right. It's always
tricky.
difficult to really describe what you're tasting because it's very subjective. So what I taste might not be the same as you can taste. And you're very suggestible too, because I've been tasting a whiskey and someone will say, oh, it's got like strawberries, and then I start tasting strawberries, but I definitely didn't taste them before. But it's yeah, it's I'd say for our Amburana, I get a ton of like baking spice and warmness, and it definitely tends to lean towards the sweeter side. The most common note that everyone says on Amburana finished whiskeys is cinnamon toast crunch, because it's got a lot of cinnamon.
Man, I gotta
in
try
it.
that.
Yeah, and then on our finish, that particularly adds a lot of complexity to the finish, and it's a fairly long finish. I get a distinct kind of toasted coconut on the finish.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was that? What was the second question, Ishil?
Which one is your favorite among the ones you make?
Well, I'm very partial to the Amburana finished whiskey, but I'm also a big fan of our gin. And I think of our gins, we have two. I really like the barrel finished version. A lot of people aren't as keen on the barrel finished version, but I think of it as kind of a bridge between gin and whiskey. It's got a lot of the characteristics of whiskey because it's barrel finished, so you get kind of the caramel and vanilla notes from the barrel, and then it kind of mutes the other botanicals as well. And I think it's a gin I have just sipped on.
That one I
neat.
tried.
Yeah.
It is great.
Yeah.
It is, because I actually don't get into the highly botanical gins. It's just like too sharp on my tongue when you can really get that juniper berry.
Yeah.
I'm just like, I wouldn't, it just kind of tastes like eating bushes.
Yeah.
But when it's the way you kind of softened it by having it in a barrel, and then the color's a little bit caramely.
Yeah.
I just love it. I think it's awesome.
It's a great example of what barrel aging a spirit does. It's both an additive and a subtractive process. It adds kind of caramel, vanilla, color, some sweetness, and then it does subtract. The botanicals all kind of get muted, and kind of you're inside a charred barrel, so you're essentially got charcoal filtering going on. So some of those botanicals kind of get toned down a bit. So
if you're talking about making a gin, obviously it's those botanicals that make it a gin. But if you didn't add those botanicals, would it just be rum, or what would it be?
Well, gin is a neutral spirit, so essentially vodka infused with botanicals, and the majority of those botanicals has to be juniper.
Okay, so it's basically a vodka with
botanicals. It's the first flavored vodka, except it was around before vodka was a category. So most gins are going to start with a neutral spirit, so usually a grain neutral spirit, and then you'll infuse botanicals in a variety of ways to create your gin. Yeah.
And so as opposed to rum, which is made from cane sugar, is that correct?
Cane sugar or cane sugar byproducts. So usually molasses, but like I mentioned cachaça, that's also a rum agricole, which is made from sugarcane juice. So you'll only find those made in the tropics, because you can't really transport sugarcane juice far before it spoils. So. And
how do folks make rum here typically? Are they finding molasses?
Yeah, usually you're going to buy like a tote of molasses, and then you can use refined sugars too to bring specific gravity up. So.
Do you guys do a rum?
We've been experimenting with a rum. JP at Hammer Spring did a rum, but he only did one batch. And we've kind of been toying with it and doing a bunch of test batches. And I think in the next year or so, we might roll out a rum. What's held me back the most is I have trouble tying rum to Utah, as opposed to like the gin. I'm using local botanicals and native botanicals, but
no pirates on the Great Salt
not
Lake.
A lot of
last
pirates.
Last time I checked.
Yeah.
Unless you want to count the giant brine shrimp.
Right. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was wondering. So I was reading an article how all these celebrities want to get into their own labels, and I love Metallica, but they got into creating a bourbon that's aged not in barrels, but using some process where I guess you get blocks of oak, and you just put the oak blocks in with the bourbon.
Yeah.
And I know there's more to it than that, but they say that that's just as effective, if not better, because they can control the wood. And obviously that's a new version of an old technique, but do you think that's legit?
I think you're extracting wood flavor, yes. So there's a lot of companies, I know a few that have done like rapid aging, doing that with basically wood blocks.
You're going to save a lot of money and time.
Yeah, so they basically put it into a vat with the wood blocks, and they pressurize it to drive it into the wood, and then they put it under a vacuum to pull it back out, and they basically are extracting flavor from the wood there. I know Garrison Brothers down in Texas, they do a lot with like wood cubes, but they do age in barrels. They just add cubes of different wood, or I know their Honeydew is a bourbon, and they add toasted oak cubes that they've infused with honey first. So kind of like doing a honey barrel, they just add the cubes. I think it's legitimate, but there's really no substitute for time, because all of those wood extraction is only part of the process for aging a bourbon. The other part of it is just letting the whiskey sit for an amount of time, and compounds in the whiskey will oxidize and estrify over time, and stuff that goes into the barrel that isn't necessarily the best flavors.
You said oxidize and estrify? What's estrify?
So estrify is alcohols and acids will break down into fatty acid ester groups. So was it? Yeah, Maker's Mark did FAE, with their license plate series special releases. FAE stood for fatty acid ester, and that's basically flavor compounds, and it takes time for those chemical reactions to happen, and you really can't speed those up any way that anyone's figured out yet. So yeah.
Cool. Well, do you have any cool new upcoming releases or programs you plan on doing for the 2025?
Like I said, so this month we're going to be releasing the unaged whiskey, and those will be in 375s or 375 milliliter bottles. And we're also working on a Pueblo chili infused vodka. So I grew up in Pueblo, Colorado, and the Pueblo chili is unique among chili peppers. It's also known as the Marisol Moscow, and that means towards the sun, because it's the only chili pepper that grows upwards as opposed to hanging down from the plant. And I grew up with it, and I'm obviously biased, but I think it's got a really great flavor profile, and it works very well infused into a vodka. So that's
is it spicy when you
it does have a fair amount of heat. The Pueblo chili kind of encompasses jalapeno peppers, so it's in the same spice range as a jalapeno. Yeah.
Cool. Well, that sounds great. All right. Well, yeah, I think that's about it. You guys are located in Salt Lake. You're only about 10, 12 minutes from downtown Salt Lake. Is that right? Yeah,
we're very close to the airport. So we're just off of Bangor Highway and 201. We're north and east of that intersection.
Do we have any more questions?
Do you want your web page?
That's wasatch.co.
Wasatch.co. That's easy.
Yep.
Oh, I got to ask one last question. Your logo has the Sasquatch.
Yes.
We've written many articles about Sasquatch. We have a writer who focuses on folklore and myths. Do you think the Sasquatch exists?
I would say I am Sasquatch agnostic. I am unsure about whether Sasquatch exists or not, but we kind of ended up with the Sasquatch
I think it's brilliant.
in our logo.
Yeah, that somebody hasn't done that already.
Yep.
I think that is an awesome logo.
Yeah, and we thought Spirits of the Wasatch and the Sasquatch kind of the unknown spirits in experimentation in our distillery. So
now, what do you think, you people who are watching? Does Sasquatch exist? Is that real, or is it just fake? Like, I notice Sasquatch is always blurry whenever the photographs have been taken. I just wonder if like Sasquatch himself, if you were to see him, if he'd be blurry.
He might be blurry. Yeah,
like, he's just like permanently blurry.
Yeah,
I heard that joke somewhere. I wish I could attribute it to who said it, but. Yeah, I appreciate you coming on, Brent.
Yeah,
I think you got an awesome
it's
thing
been a
going
great
on,
time.
and I think you've really kicked it up a notch. I really respected Hammer Springs, but you've really introduced some awesome new products, and yeah, I really can't wait to try your. I want to say amaretto, but you call it
Amburana.
Amburana.
Yeah,
yeah, Amburana infused
Yep.
or aged. So.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks for coming in.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'll plug our Faces of Utah magazine. You guys can pick this up for $5 a month if you become a member. If you sign up for even 3 months of membership, you'll get this. And I believe it has at least a $15 value. It's a leadership and entrepreneurial success magazine. It's our first issue. We worked on it for 18 months. And this Teaching Toughness from Kyle Whittingham's story is one that I worked on for 3 months. And it's really the secret formula to taking tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 athletes and turning them into top tier athletes and performers. What Kyle Whittingham's done for the last 20 years in that program to create such awesome athletes. I think any leader would want to learn that formula. And then just all these great entrepreneurs around Utah who have really done incredible things with their businesses, including Brent and his wife. Sorry, I should have asked you, what's your wife's name again?
Jenica.
Jenica, and
Yes.
she helps you as well.
Yeah.
So you can pick it up. Go visit utahstories.com, become a member of Utah Stories, and you also help with our investigative journalism we work on, and also brought to you by Utah Stories magazine.